Hi friends, my name is Host Eric. I am the host of Talking with Famous People and the bringer of the truths about cognitive functions. I was just watching a Frank James video in which he repeats a falsehood that is I hear repeated constantly and inspires me to make this top 5 myths people believe about cognitive functions video. Number 5. Extroverted feeling is subjective. Extroverted feeling, like extroverted thinking, is neither subjective nor objective in any meaningful sense of the word. They are interface functions. Extroverted feeling takes other people's subjective data as extroverted feeling takes objective data about people's subjective expressions, or renders it into objects of analysis and deals with it objectively, and then renders back into the subjective. So similarly does extroverted thinking take what you subjectively want and render it into a set of ordinals, how to get something accomplished in the real world. Is that objective or subjective? Well, both FE and TE use some objective data being data that is accessible to all people in the external world, and both FE and TE link in some sense to subjective data. FE to the other person's subjective data, and TE to one's own subjective data. So they're neither subjective nor objective in terms of the data they deal with. In terms of the top level frame, well, TE would be subjective in that because it starts with an interested calculus that is FI, but that's not TE that's being subjective, that's FI. So really, the answer is FE and TE are neither subjective nor objective, and so to say that extroverted feeling is subjective is incorrect. So number 5. Number 4, here's a nod to C.S. Joseph. Introverted intuition is willpower. Willpower is not a cognitive function, per se. It's the ability to sustain discomfort or to sustain an activity for more time with more persistence than a norm, for example, or a mean. That may or may not link to some cognitive functions stuff, but it certainly isn't at all descriptive of introverted intuition to call it willpower. Introverted intuition is first and foremost intuition, obviously. We know what intuition is. It's the distillation of an aha moment from a bunch of clues, is one example of it that seems pretty commonplace. That's not related at all to willpower. To the extent that one was going to associate a function with willpower, one would, I suppose, associate it with extroverted sensing, in the sense that extroverted sensing is about pulling the trigger on things and about following through on decisions already made, doing the steps necessary. Not figuring out which steps are necessary, but doing the steps necessary. So introverted intuition is willpower? Absolute nonsense. Wouldn't be a myth that people in general believe, except for the fact that C.S. Joseph has perpetrated this nonsense. Okay. Myth number 3. Introverted feeling is ethical. Now, this one is not to be laying at C.S. Joseph's feet. This is to be laying at the feet of socionics people who insist on calling introverted and extroverted feeling ethical functions. Of course, introverted feeling is not ethical. The glee that somebody feels while torturing something, if they are a bad person, is an example of introverted feeling. The willingness of a mother to trample people to get to her own child, to save her own child, is an example of introverted feeling. But that's not ethical at all, nor moral. It's an interested calculus, first and foremost. It's the authentic valuing of what's important. Some things that are important to people, are pretty universally important, are matters that we generally consider matters of ethics or morality, such as an inherent revulsion to suffering, one might say, links to introverted feeling, except for the fact that if you feel justice is very much served by the suffering of another, you might feel satisfaction at their suffering. So it's hard to say in any meaningful sense that introverted feeling is ethical, although it does seem to link to a basic understanding that things hurt and preventing harm is of value, especially when you love the thing. that doesn't make it ethical. Ethics and morality, those are reason-based calculi and or intuition-based calculi, not feelings-based. Number 2, introverted thinking is subjective. Now, talk about a pile of obvious garbage. The words objective and subjective mean one of two things. They're either referring to data, or actually one of three things. They're referring to data, they're referring to people, which is kind of an incorrect usage of them, which said, this person fundamentally on a regular basis doesn't think objectively or something. Or they're referring to calculations. So the way we ought to think about the terms with cognitive functions is as calculatory matters. If I evaluate a matter subjectively, I'm using my feelings to determine what I want, and then I'll shape the reality to be true with that. So, for example, if my team is called for a foul, I'm like, oh, come on, ref, you did a terrible job. But if the other team's called for a foul, good job, ref, good job, right? So I'm interpreting the foul calling and officiating in general stuff through the lens of my feelings in that instance, not through the lens of an objective calculation. If it were objective, then probably it wouldn't be the case that all the time, almost, like 90% of the time, the officials are calling it wrong for my team, and so that's a subjective calculation. An objective calculation is one that takes a disinterested calculus. That's what introverted thinking does. It says, let's pretend that interests, one's own benefits or losses or whatever, are not involved in this at all. As an objective or dispassionate judge, not biased towards either side, which is correct. That's a matter for introverted thinking. And in fact, introverted thinking is how we objectively, logically parse out what's defensible and why. So things need to be consistent with also another aspect of objectivity, which is intuition. To a certain extent, we validate whether something's correct or not by checking against our intuition. If I am saying, here's a good standard to use to determine whether something's moral, but it allows some horrible atrocity and says that's okay, then we use our intuition to say, well, this moral this moral metric must be inadequate because it's validated something that's clearly not valid. So the thing is, that's how introverted thinking operates. Introverted thinking is objective because it is the logic of the universal communicative logic, namely grammar, words, stuff like that. Whereas other systems each have their own logic, like a washing machine has a logic that's different than a microwave. Okay, and the number one myth that people believe about cognitive functions: introverted intuition is subjective. Like extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, which are neither subjective nor objective, but which deal with subjective and objective data, introverted intuition, and also introverted sensing, are neither objective nor subjective because they are knowledge functions. Okay? What that means is that if I know something, let's say I remember something, I have a memory. What did you have for breakfast, Eric? I had some of these peanut butter things and a Uncrustable. Well, that's knowledge. Am I being objective about it? No. Am I being subjective about it? No. Is it subjective data? Yes. I'm being neither objective nor subjective about it because it's not a calculation. One deliberates out calculations. One does not deliberate out knowledge. Knowledge is just known. In this particular instance, the question at hand is one that the answer is known from subjective data, my own memory. Introverted intuition uses the opposite kind of data, objective data, but it knows in the same way. So, whereas introverted sensing knows what I ate for breakfast, introverted intuition knows which song is better. It knows about objects outside of itself. So, is introverted intuition subjective? Absolutely not. Is it objective? Not really. But if you had to classify introverted intuition as either objective or subjective, because it intuits about the object, you would say it's more objective than it is subjective. Certainly, it's the universal intuition about the universal, not intuition about the particular. So, to wrap this all up, number one thing to remember is that there are only two functions that are either objective or subjective: introverted thinking and introverted feeling. The reason those two functions are objective and subjective, respectively, is because they are actually making calculations that require one to be either biased or unbiased, honest or dishonest, objective or subjective. Introverted thinking is how one removes the interested factor from the calculation, and introverted feeling is how one considers the interested factor. The second big takeaway from this is that when we describe things like introverted feeling and extroverted feeling both as ethical functions, first of all, extroverted feeling is a different kind of function than introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is deliberation. Extroverted feeling is an interface function. So they're not ethical also because ethics it refers to systems of morality that are clearly not ever articulated as feelings. So it doesn't make any sense. And I guess the third and final takeaway of this is C.S. Joseph thinks introverted intuition is willpower. Therefore, if you think that C.S. Joseph is a good authority on these matters, I repeat, he thinks introverted intuition is willpower. Which isn't even, that's not, I mean, right? So hopefully I will continue to spread the word that this stuff that people say is nonsense. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.